In celebration of Florida Arbor Day, today we are going to discuss proper tree planting for Terminology Tuesday. The first step is locating a tree. And so you need a retailer who is knowledgeable about our native plants and sells them, has them in stock. The Florida Association of Native Nurseries has an excellent website, plantrealflorida.org, which has a map of all of the native plant nurseries across the state and has all the contact information for them so you can find the closest native plant retailer to you. Before you pick what species you're planting and visit the nursery, you'll want to know a few basic facts about your yard. You'll want to know the amount of sun exposure in your yard, the general area that you have in mind for the tree. And especially, you'll need to know the type of soil that you have. So you'll want to dig a little bit in that area and see, is your soil sandy or clayey? Is it rich with organic matter? Taking photos of your yard to show the sun exposure and taking photos of your soil to share with a qualified nurseryman will be really helpful so they can help you make the best decision for the species that would work best in your yard. Once you've selected the species, you'll need to consider the inventory the nursery has, and you'll be selecting what size container you're purchasing. When you're picking trees, smaller is always better. And I know it goes against, our mentality of bigger is better and wanting an instant gratification and being able to see a large tree when you first plant it. But I would urge everyone to plant smaller because they always are more healthy, they're faster growing, and they live longer and have less issues with pests and disease because they are just healthier. Plants and trees especially really don't enjoy being in pots, and it's very stressful for them and can even stunt their growth for years to come. So resist the urge for instant gratification and choose a smaller tree. Pine trees especially can be very stunted by being in too small of a container for too long. This beautiful longleaf pine I planted was only a couple feet tall. It was just leaving its grass stage when I planted it, and it has grown really quickly because it was young and healthy when I planted it. Smaller trees often outpace the growth of larger trees that have been pot bound for years and planted. I wanted to get a pine to demonstrate planting a pine for you guys today. I wanted to get a bare root pine and a potted pine, but unfortunately the nursery I went to, all of the pines, they were in 3-gallon pots, so about this big, and the trees were over 5 feet tall in that small pot. And with my experience, I know that tree has been in that pot for too long, is going to be slow growing, and is just generally not going to be as healthy as a younger tree. So for the purposes of demonstration, I decided to show you guys some different species. So today we are going to be planting a fringe tree, Chiananthus virginicus, and red cedar. This is Juniperus virginiana. This mistake most people make in tree planting that ensures a slow and miserable death of the tree you've selected is to plant it too deeply. Most trees can withstand being planted too shallowly, but being planted too deeply just slowly kills them over time. So before you dig your hole, before you begin planting, you'll need to unpot your tree to make sure how deep it is in the pot, because unfortunately a lot of nurseries will plant the trees too deeply in the pot that you purchased them in, and the top root flare, the main root coming up from the top, should be visible at the soil level. And so you want to make sure you're digging a hole that is only as deep as the top root flare to the bottom of this pot. Once you unpot your tree, pull the soil from around the base of the trunk and keep pulling until you find the large top root flare. So these are all fibrous roots. They don't count. This plant, unfortunately, was planted too deeply in the pot. But you see here, if you look closely, you can see that that's the root flare right here. This main tap root is flaring out, and I can feel another one here on this side. And so that's where I know I want the soil level to be right there when I plant this tree. It's okay to even have it even shallower than that, but deeper than that, you know, even an inch above, and that tree is going to have issues. So now we know we're going to dig a hole only as deep as this, which is pretty shallow, but that's key. And then the width of your hole is going to be about twice as wide as the pot. So we'll be digging a hole about this wide and only this deep for this plant. Dug a little hole that's about twice as wide as the pot and only as deep. We can put that guy in there and make sure, yep, that soil level is just below this main tap root here, the root flare on the trunk. And so I know that's ideal. Even a little bit above is always better than too deeply. Another common mistake is to purchase soil to fill the hole. You want to just use the soil you dug out, and that's called backfill. Research has shown that when you amend the soil too well in the hole, the roots do not go out searching and establish themselves well enough, you know, looking for nutrients when all of the nutrients are right there in the hole. And so their root system often becomes more contained in that one area rather than more established. And they are more susceptible to drought. They're more susceptible to falling over from wind. They're just generally less healthy. So you just want to use the backfill, just use what you dug out. You can amend the soil and top dress with fertilizer once the tree has established a root system, but that's not necessary right at planting. Another key ingredient before planting is to check the root ball. You want any roots that are root bound and growing, you want to tear those up. If it's a larger specimen, sometimes you need to use like a knife or something to tear them up. And especially if you notice one of these big, thick tap roots, if it is wrapping at all around the pot in any areas, you need to cut it right where it begins to turn, where it hit that pot and started wrapping around. Generally, seeing those thick tap roots wrapping around is not a good sign as far as the health of the tree, but it can still be a healthy and established tree if you trim those tap roots that wrap around. If you don't trim them, those large roots will continue to grow in circles really throughout its life. It can actually end up strangling the trunk, or it just makes it super susceptible to wind and drought because the roots are not growing in the way that they should. So you're going to tear up those roots and then you're going to begin planting. So we fill in with the backfill, and as you're doing that, tamp down the soil so that there aren't any air pockets. And if it's a much larger specimen, sometimes you can use some kind of tool to tamp down. Sometimes the back of your shovel works well. And then we'll water it really well in order to make sure that there aren't any air pockets down in that soil. As you can see here, the soil level is right about here. And because we've tamped down the soil so well, and because, you know, I've taken out the grass and sod that was around it, the tree looks like a little bit above where you would think it should be, right? But that's where the soil level is, and this will fill in with organic matter. And again, even though it might look like it's planted too shallowly, it's always best to err on the side of planting too shallow than too deep. And so I know that this tree is going to be fine. It will do really well. And with this little divot here, it'll be easier to water this because there is a little, a slight depression here. It will be helpful in watering it thoroughly, which is critically important for the long-term success of the tree. Thoroughly water at the time of planting, which means we're going to want to fill up this hole and let it really soak in. We want to water deeply. Every time you do water, you want to water really deeply. When you water too shallowly, you're encouraging roots to stay up at the soil surface, and that means that they're more susceptible to drought. So I'm just letting this water, it's not too high, so it's not disturbing the soil. I'm just letting it drip in and soak and really fill in this area to make sure the deep soil beneath the plant is well watered. One of the advantages of planting in winter in January is that the plants are not actively growing, so they don't need as much water, and it's not as hot, and so the soil is not losing as much water through evaporation. So it's easier to maintain their needs for watering. I would probably check this again in like 4 to 5 days, and you just want to, touch the soil and see if it feels damp. And if it still feels very wet, you don't need to water again. But when this top of the soil begins to dry out, then you want to soak it again. And when you water, again, every time you want to water really deeply. You don't want to shallowly water ever, because that's not healthy for the root system. The season continues and it begins to get hotter and the plant begins to actively grow, we'll need to water probably more frequently depending on the amount of rain that we get. So you'll have to pay attention to the rain we're getting, and you'll have to pay attention to the soil moisture by just touching it. It's not necessary to fertilize it right when you plant it. 1, because it's not actively growing. 2, it doesn't have an established root system yet to take up those nutrients. And 3, plants in pots typically already have fertilizer in the pots they were planted in. So there's likely already some existing fertilizer available. And my soil is pretty nutrient rich. I have good kind of rich clay soil that holds a lot of nutrients. If I am going to use fertilizer, I would use a slow release organic fertilizer like this Plant Tone. You can get smaller bags of it, and I would just dress, around the edges, not right up next to the trunk, at least a few inches away from the trunk. Just top dress according to, the directions on the bag. But again, I'm not going to fertilize it now because it's just not necessary. Another mistake that is often made is people use too much mulch and use the mulch too close to the trunk. So you can add mulch. I definitely recommend adding mulch, but you don't want to shove it up against the trunk. You want to give the trunk area to breathe. So what we recommend is to not put mulch any closer than that root ball was. So about the size of the actual pot that I planted it in. I don't want to mulch. I want to mulch right up to that and not any closer in. If you wanted, you could take back more of this sod to prevent it competing too much. But I also like to use pine straw because it's, very sustainable and renewable resource in Florida. And, it breaks down and builds your soil. But again, I don't want to shove it all up against the tree like that. It's not as much big of a deal with pine straw because pine straw is much more loose and airable. But if you use heavy pine bark mulch is great, but you don't want that pine bark mulch close up to the trunk of the tree. You want to give it room to breathe. It also makes it easier to water because that's where you're going to bring your hose up to and water your little depression there. And so there we are. We've got this successfully planted eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, and it's going to become a nice large tree that is very long-lived. I also wanted to demonstrate planting a bare root tree seedling because I wanted to encourage people to purchase bare root trees. They are generally much cheaper, much less expensive because much less work and time and resources have gone into growing them. And they also are often much healthier in the long run because they haven't ever been in a pot. You do have to be careful when you purchase bare root. You want to plant them as soon as possible. And if you can't plant them right away, you can do what's called healing them in, which means that you just dig a hole anywhere in the ground and stick them in the ground, make sure their roots are moist, kept moist, and water them occasionally. This is a fringe tree, Chiananthus virginicus, which is a fairly small native tree that has beautiful fringe-like flowers in spring. And one thing I didn't mention when we were talking about the red cedar is when you are choosing a tree, you want to make sure that the tree has a healthy leader, that main trunk. If it is broken off here and has a bunch of branches rather than one true leader, that's going to be a less healthy plant in the long run, more prone to breaking and other issues. Planting a bare root is pretty similar to what we've already gone over. You want to dig a hole that's about twice as wide, you know, as if it were in a pot, and then only as deep really as this main root flare right here. You see, that's the root flare, that top main tap root that's coming out. We don't want that to be below the soil. We want it to be at or above the soil level. So I have dug a little hole here, and I'm gonna create for this, because it doesn't have an established, you know, root ball, I'm gonna create kind of a little propped up platform for it to rest on in there. And it's really helpful if the soil is already wet like it is here. And you can even water as you're doing this. And make sure, again, that that soil level is not above that main taproot coming out there. And then we will tamp the soil in. And then we're going to water it in really thoroughly, which is super critical for a bare root tree. So here we are. The soil level in the hole is a little bit lower than the actual soil level. And so we want to, you know, the tree might look like it's a little high up in the hole, but it's not. That top root is right around the soil level. And again, it's better to be even shallower than it is to be too deep. And so I'm going to go ahead and mulch now around the edges. Water it in a little bit more thoroughly, probably. And with young trees, if there's anything attached, or any size tree, if there's anything attached to the actual trunk, like tape or anything, or a stake in the pot, you want to remove that at the time of planting. If the tree needs to be staked, some larger trees might need to be staked, you'll need to get larger metal stakes that will go not close to the trunk. They'll go away from the trunk on either side, and you can kind of loosely tie the tree to either side to keep it held up. But anything that might girdle, impede the growth of that trunk needs to be removed at the time of planting. For smaller trees, I like to use a tomato cage to mark them so that they don't get mowed over or weed whacked, which is an issue. And then you can, when you remove, you know, the tag or the name, you can attach it to the cage for the time being. And I'll probably keep this cage around this plant for a year or so to make sure that somebody doesn't actually accidentally step on it, to keep my dogs off of it, and to, you know, avoid any harm to the trunk, because the trunk is sensitive. You want to avoid any sort of physical damage to the trunk. Those are the basics of tree planting. I hope you guys learned some stuff today. And remember that native plants are the basis of our food web. They are providing, you know, habitat and food for wildlife, and also a myriad of other ecosystem services like clean air, clean water that we rely on for our health and happiness. So celebrate Arbor Day by planting a native tree.